Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle journey through the corridors of time. Tonight, let us slowly drift together into the medieval world, where crowns were heavy with more than just gold, and thrones held secrets of sleepless nights and endless burdens. Close your eyes, if you will, and allow yourself to settle into a comfortable position as we explore the miserable truth about being a medieval king. Picture yourself standing in a vast stone courtyard on a quiet morning in the year 1347. The mist clings gently to the ancient walls of a royal castle, and the soft sound of your footsteps echoes against weathered stones that have witnessed centuries of triumph and tragedy. Today, we shall walk in the shadow of medieval kings, understanding not their glory, but their profound human struggles. Let the weight of their stories settle over you like a warm blanket as we uncover the lonely reality behind the crown. Imagine, if you will, the cold touch of a golden circlet being placed upon your head for the first time. The metal is heavier than you expected, pressing down upon your temples with an almost crushing weight. This is not merely a symbol of power. It is a burden that will never leave your shoulders, not even in sleep. The medieval king lived in a world where divine right met human frailty, where every decision could mean life or death for thousands, and where the crown became both blessing and curse. Let us begin our gentle exploration by understanding what it truly meant to inherit a throne in medieval Europe. The morning sun filters through the narrow windows of a royal bedchamber, casting long shadows across tapestries that tell stories of ancestral victories. But the young prince awakening in that bed knows that his childhood ended the moment his father drew his final breath. There was no preparation that could truly ready a soul for the absolute responsibility that came with kingship. Picture young Edward, barely 16, receiving news of his father's death while hunting in the forests of Gloucestershire. The messenger's words echo through the trees like a death knell of his own innocence. From this moment forward, every breath he takes will be measured against the needs of his kingdom. Every meal will be tasted for poison. Every smile will be calculated for political advantage. Every friendship will be questioned for ulterior motives. The transformation from prince to king was immediate and merciless. There were no gradual transitions, no gentle learning curves. One moment you were a young man with hopes and dreams. The next, you were the earthly representative of God's will, responsible for the souls and bodies of every person within your realm. The weight of this responsibility was so profound that many kings spoke of feeling crushed beneath it, as if the very air had become too thick to breathe. Consider the daily routine of a medieval monarch and let yourself drift into the rhythm of these ancient days. The king would awaken before dawn, not from choice, but from necessity. Sleep was a luxury that few kings could afford in abundance. The castle stirred to life around him like a living organism, with hundreds of servants, courtiers and officials, all dependent upon his word for their very existence. The morning ablutions were a ceremony in themselves. Imagine the gentle splash of water poured from silver ewers into marble basins, the soft rustle of silk robes being arranged by trembling hands. Even these private moments were not truly private. Servants watched every gesture, ready to report any sign of weakness or illness to enemies who might use such information to their advantage. The king could never truly be alone, never truly be unguarded, never truly be himself. As we continue our gentle journey through these medieval mornings, picture the king's private chapel, where he would kneel in prayer as the first light of dawn painted the stained glass windows in soft, ethereal colors. This was perhaps the only time when the monarch could speak honestly about his fears and doubts. Here, surrounded by the sacred silence of stone and shadow, he could admit to God what he could never admit to any living soul: that he was terrified. The prayers of medieval kings were not the triumphant declarations we might imagine. They were desperate pleas for wisdom, for strength to bear the unbearable, for forgiveness, for the decisions that would inevitably lead to suffering. These men understood that every choice they made would ripple through history, affecting generations yet unborn. The weight of such foresight was crushing. Let your mind wander now to the great hall where the king would hold court each morning. The massive space echoes with whispered conversations and the soft shuffle of hundreds of feet on cold stone floors. Nobles dressed in their finest clothes bow deeply as the king approaches his throne, but behind their respectful smiles lurk ambition, jealousy, and often treachery. The throne itself was designed to impress and intimidate, carved from the finest woods and adorned with precious metals and gems. But for the man who sat upon it day after day, it became a prison. The high back offered no comfort, the arms provided no rest, and the seat seemed designed to remind its occupant that comfort was not meant for kings. Hours would pass as the monarch listened to disputes, made judgments, and navigated the treacherous waters of court politics. Each case brought before the throne carried the weight of real human suffering. Picture the king listening to a dispute between two nobles over land rights, knowing that his decision would determine not only their fates, but the fates of the hundreds of peasants who worked their fields. Choose incorrectly, and families would starve. Show favor to the wrong noble, and rebellion might follow. The responsibility was overwhelming. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the great hall, the king would receive reports from across his realm. Messages arrived on horseback from distant provinces, carried by riders whose horses were lathered with sweat and whose faces were marked by urgency. Each message brought news that required immediate attention. A plague outbreak in the northern counties, raiders crossing the eastern border, a failed harvest threatening famine in the west. Let yourself imagine the gentle scratch of quill pens on parchment as scribes recorded the king's decisions. Every word was weighed carefully, for written commands carried the full force of royal authority. A misplaced phrase could lead to unnecessary bloodshed. A moment's inattention could result in a diplomatic crisis. The medieval king lived in constant awareness that his words once spoken could never be recalled. The burden of decision-making extended far beyond the formal court sessions. Medieval kings were expected to be military leaders, master strategists, diplomatic negotiators, economic planners, and spiritual guides to their people. They needed to understand everything from crop rotation to castle fortification, from maritime trade routes to the complex web of feudal obligations that held society together. Consider the loneliness that settled over these rulers like morning mist. Surrounded by hundreds of people, they were often the most isolated individuals in their kingdoms. True friendship was nearly impossible when every relationship was colored by political considerations. Love was complicated by dynastic requirements. Even family relationships were strained by the harsh realities of medieval politics. Marriage, for a medieval king, was rarely a matter of personal choice or affection. Let your mind drift to a royal wedding ceremony with its magnificent pageantry and solemn vows. Behind the celebration lay cold political calculation. The bride was chosen not for her beauty or kindness, but for the strategic alliance her family could provide. The king might meet his future queen for the first time on their wedding day, expected to build a life partnership with a stranger who had been selected by advisors and negotiated like a trade agreement. The pressure to produce male heirs added another layer of stress to royal marriages. The king's private life became a matter of state concern. Courtiers and advisors tracked the queen's monthly cycles, speculated about her fertility, and monitored the royal couple's intimate relationship with an intensity that would be unthinkable today. The failure to produce sons was seen not as a personal tragedy, but as a threat to the stability of the entire kingdom. Picture a king pacing the corridors of his castle late at night, unable to sleep as he contemplates the future of his dynasty. Each step echoes through empty halls lined with portraits of his ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to watch and judge his every move. The weight of their legacy pressed down upon him, demanding that he measure up to their achievements while surpassing their failures. The medieval king's relationship with his nobles was a delicate dance of mutual dependence and suspicion. These powerful lords controlled vast territories and commanded their own armies. They owed fealty to the crown, but their loyalty was often conditional and temporary. The king needed their support to govern effectively, but he also had to guard constantly against their ambitions. Let yourself imagine the tension in a royal council meeting, where the king sat surrounded by men who smiled and bowed, while secretly calculating how they might benefit from his downfall. Every word was carefully chosen, every gesture analyzed for hidden meaning. Trust was a luxury that could prove fatal. Paranoia was a survival skill. The concept of divine right, which suggested that kings ruled by God's will, provided some comfort but also added tremendous pressure. If the kingdom prospered, it was seen as evidence of God's favor. If disaster struck, plague, famine, military defeat, it was interpreted as divine displeasure with the monarch's rule. The king carried not only the practical responsibility for his people's welfare, but also the spiritual burden of their relationship with the Almighty. Consider the physical toll that kingship took on medieval rulers. The constant stress, irregular meals, and lack of proper rest aged them prematurely. Many kings developed what we would now recognize as stress-related illnesses, stomach ailments, headaches, difficulty sleeping. The medieval understanding of medicine offered little relief for these psychosomatic symptoms. The king's diet, while rich and varied compared to that of common people, was also fraught with danger. Every meal had to be tested for poison. Food tasters risked their lives to ensure the monarch's safety, and the king often had to watch others eat his food first, waiting to see if they showed signs of illness before daring to take a bite himself. Sleep, that most basic human need, became elusive for medieval kings. Picture a royal bedchamber, with its massive four-poster bed draped in the finest silks and surrounded by guards. Yet the man lying beneath those expensive covers often stared at the ceiling for hours, his mind racing through the day's problems and tomorrow's challenges. The weight of the crown seemed to press down even in rest, making peaceful sleep nearly impossible. Dreams, when they came, were often filled with the faces of those who had died by the king's command. Medieval justice was harsh, and kings were frequently required to order executions, approve military campaigns that would result in thousands of deaths, and make decisions that would lead to suffering for innocent people. These choices haunted their sleep, creating nightmares that followed them through the darkness. The medieval king's relationship with his children was complicated by the demands of statecraft. Sons were potential heirs, but also potential rivals. The history of medieval Europe is filled with stories of princes who rebelled against their fathers, sometimes with justification. The king had to balance paternal love with political necessity, often sending his sons away for education or military training when his heart yearned to keep them close. Daughters were valued primarily for the marriage alliances they could secure. A king might love his daughter dearly, but he would still arrange her marriage to a stranger in a foreign land if it served the kingdom's interests. The personal pain of these separations was intense, but showing such emotions was seen as weakness in a ruler. Let your thoughts drift now to the seasonal rhythms that governed medieval royal life. Summer brought the campaigning season, when kings were expected to lead their armies into battle personally. The image we might have of kings directing battles from safe distances is largely incorrect. Medieval monarchs were expected to be in the thick of combat, inspiring their troops through personal courage and sharing their dangers. Picture a king donning his armor on a misty dawn before battle. The weight of mail and plate was enormous, but it was nothing compared to the weight of responsibility he carried. He knew that his presence on the battlefield could mean the difference between victory and defeat, but he also knew that his death would throw the kingdom into chaos. Yet he had no choice but to ride forward, lance in hand, toward an uncertain fate. The aftermath of battle was perhaps even more challenging than the combat itself. Kings had to walk among the wounded and dying, making decisions about prisoners, managing the distribution of booty, and dealing with the complex emotions that followed violence. Victory brought relief, but also the burden of deciding what to do with conquered territories and defeated enemies. Winter provided some respite from military campaigns, but it brought its own challenges. The king's court would settle into one of the royal castles for the cold months, and the confined space intensified political tensions. Imagine the long, dark evenings filled with careful conversations, where every word was weighed for political implications and every gesture was analyzed for hidden meaning. The medieval king's understanding of his realm was often limited by the technology and communication methods of his time. News traveled slowly, often reaching the royal court weeks or months after events had occurred. A king might make a decision based on outdated information, only to discover later that circumstances had changed completely. This uncertainty made effective governance extremely difficult. Consider the challenge of medieval taxation, a constant source of friction between king and subjects. The monarch needed revenue to maintain his court, pay his soldiers, and fund his building projects, but every tax imposed risked rebellion. The king had to balance the kingdom's financial needs against his subjects' ability to pay, while also navigating the complex web of feudal obligations that determined who owed what to whom. The legal system of medieval Europe placed enormous responsibility on the king as the final arbiter of justice. Appeals from lower courts eventually reached the throne, and the monarch was expected to have the wisdom of Solomon in making his judgments. The knowledge that his decisions would set precedents for future cases added another layer of pressure to every ruling. Religious obligations consumed a significant portion of the medieval king's time and energy. He was expected to be a model of Christian virtue while simultaneously making decisions that sometimes contradicted Christian teachings. The tension between political necessity and religious morality created constant internal conflict for many rulers. Let yourself imagine the king kneeling in his private chapel late at night, seeking guidance from God, while knowing that tomorrow he might have to order actions that would cause suffering to his people. The contradiction between Christian ideals of mercy and forgiveness and the harsh realities of medieval governance was a source of profound spiritual anguish for many monarchs. The court ceremonies that surrounded medieval kingship were magnificent spectacles, but they were also exhausting performances. The king was always on display, always expected to embody the dignity and power of his office. There was no time when he could simply be human, no moment when he could let down his guard and reveal his true feelings. Picture the elaborate rituals of a royal feast with their complex protocols and symbolic meanings. The king sat at the high table, elevated above his guests, but also isolated from genuine human interaction. Every gesture was prescribed by tradition, every word measured for its impact on royal prestige. The feast was a performance, and the king was always the lead actor in a play he could never escape. The seasonal progress, when the royal court traveled from castle to castle throughout the kingdom, was both necessary and exhausting. These journeys allowed the king to show himself to his subjects and address local problems personally. But they also involved enormous logistical challenges. Moving hundreds of people, along with their possessions, furniture, and supplies, was like relocating a small city every few weeks. Imagine the dust and noise of a royal progress winding through the medieval countryside. The king rode at the head of the procession, smiling and waving to the crowds that gathered to see him. But his mind was occupied with concerns about the next castle's defenses, the loyalty of local nobles, and the 1,000 details that could go wrong during such a complex journey. The medieval king's education continued throughout his reign as he struggled to master the countless skills required for effective rule. He needed to understand military strategy, economics, law, diplomacy, and dozens of other subjects. There were no schools for kings, no systematic preparation for the overwhelming complexity of royal responsibility. Consider the challenge of managing the royal household, which was like a small city in itself. Hundreds of servants, officials, and courtiers depended on the king's favor for their livelihoods. Each had their own ambitions, jealousies, and schemes. The monarch had to navigate these complex relationships while ensuring that his household ran efficiently and remained loyal. The king's personal relationships were inevitably affected by his position. Friendship was complicated by the fact that everyone wanted something from him. Love was tainted by the knowledge that even his closest companions might betray him if the price was right. Trust became a precious commodity that had to be rationed carefully. Let your mind wander to the private moments when a medieval king might steal away to a high tower or secluded garden, seeking a few minutes of solitude. Even then, guards would be nearby, and the weight of his responsibilities would follow him like a shadow. There was no escape from the crown, no vacation from kingship, no retirement from the burden of rule. The health of the king was a matter of state concern. Any illness, however minor, became the subject of intense speculation and political maneuvering. Enemies watched for signs of weakness, while allies worried about succession. The king could not afford to appear vulnerable even when he was genuinely suffering. Medieval medicine offered little effective treatment for most ailments, and kings often endured pain and discomfort that could easily be treated today. They suffered from dental problems, digestive issues, and injuries from hunting and warfare, all while maintaining the facade of strength and invincibility that their position required. The king's death was often as difficult as his life. Many medieval monarchs died young, worn down by stress, disease, or violence. Even those who lived to old age rarely experienced peaceful deaths. The deathbed became another political arena, where competing factions gathered to influence the succession and protect their own interests. Picture the final moments of a medieval king, surrounded not by loving family members, but by ambitious nobles calculating their positions in the new reign. Even in death, the king served the state first and his own needs last. His final words would be recorded and analyzed for political significance. His funeral would be a state occasion designed to reinforce royal authority rather than provide comfort to those who mourned him personally. The legacy of medieval kingship was complex and often contradictory. History tends to remember the successful military campaigns and the grand building projects, but it often overlooks the human cost of royal power. The men who wore crowns paid a price that cannot be measured in gold or territory. Yet despite all these burdens and sorrows, medieval kings continued to rule, driven by duty, divine mandate, and the knowledge that someone had to bear the weight of governance. They sacrificed their personal happiness for the stability of their realms, giving up normal human relationships for the lonely eminence of the throne. As we reach the end of our gentle journey through the medieval world, let yourself reflect on the profound humanity of these rulers. Behind the crowns and ceremonies, the pageantry and power, were men who struggled with the same fears and doubts that plague all human beings. They were not superhuman figures, but ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, doing their best to fulfill impossible expectations. The miserable truth about being a medieval king was that it required the sacrifice of everything that makes life personally fulfilling in service of something larger than oneself. These rulers gave up their freedom, their privacy, their ability to form genuine relationships, and often their health and happiness, all for the sake of their kingdoms and their people. Perhaps as you drift towards sleep tonight, You can find some comfort in knowing that even the most powerful people in history struggled with loneliness, doubt, and fear. The human condition, in all its complexity and challenge, is shared by all of us, regardless of our station in life. The medieval kings, for all their power and privilege, were ultimately just human beings trying to do their best in difficult circumstances. Let the weight of their stories settle gently over you now, like a soft blanket of understanding and compassion. These ancient rulers, with all their burdens and sorrows, have returned to dust, but their struggles remind us of the shared humanity that connects us across the centuries. Rest now, knowing that tomorrow's challenges, whatever they may be, are manageable when faced with courage and wisdom. Sleep well, dear listener, and may your dreams be filled with the peace that eluded the medieval kings we have remembered tonight. Their stories fade into the gentle darkness, leaving only the quiet understanding that we are all, in our own ways, carrying crowns that are heavier than they appear. The seasons of medieval kingship moved like a slow, inevitable tide, each bringing its own particular burdens and sorrows. Let your mind drift now to the spring months, when the frozen ground began to thaw and the king's thoughts turned to the year's campaigns. This was the season of preparation, when decisions made in the warmth of winter fires would soon be tested by the harsh realities of warfare and diplomacy. Picture a medieval king standing at the window of his solar, watching the first green shoots emerge from the dark earth of his castle's gardens. The sight that should have brought joy instead filled him with dread, for spring meant that the roads would soon be passable again. Enemies who had spent the winter plotting would now be able to move their armies. Allies who had promised support in comfortable castle halls would now be tested by the reality of cold steel and spilled blood. The king's correspondence during these months was filled with urgent requests and desperate pleas. Lords throughout his realm wrote asking for reinforcements, for financial support, for permission to raise taxes to fund their own defenses. Each letter represented not just political calculation, but human suffering, families who would be displaced, young men who would die in battles they barely understood, communities that would be destroyed by the chaos of war. Imagine the weight of these decisions settling over the monarch like a heavy cloak. To grant every request would bankrupt the royal treasury and leave the kingdom defenseless. To deny them might mean abandoning loyal subjects to their enemies. There was no perfect choice, no decision that would not result in tragedy for someone. The king learned to live with the knowledge that his choices would inevitably lead to death and suffering, no matter how carefully he weighed the alternatives. The Easter season brought its own complex emotions for medieval rulers. The Christian message of redemption and forgiveness contrasted sharply with the harsh realities of kingship. As the king knelt in his chapel on Easter morning, listening to sermons about mercy and love, he knew that within days he might have to order executions or approve military campaigns that would claim thousands of lives. This spiritual tension was perhaps one of the heaviest burdens of medieval kingship. The church taught that all souls were equal in God's sight, yet the feudal system that the king was sworn to uphold was built on fundamental inequality. The Bible spoke of turning the other cheek, yet the king's survival often depended on swift and brutal retaliation against his enemies. These contradictions created a constant state of spiritual unease that troubled many medieval monarchs throughout their reigns. Let yourself imagine the quiet moments of doubt that plagued these rulers during their private prayers. In the flickering candlelight of a royal chapel, with the weight of the crown removed and placed carefully on a silk cushion, the king could acknowledge his fears and uncertainties to God. These were perhaps the only honest conversations in his life. Moments when he could admit that he felt overwhelmed, that he questioned his decisions, that he longed for the simple life he could never have. The arrival of summer brought the campaigning season in earnest. Picture the controlled chaos of a royal army preparing to march. Thousands of men gathered in the castle's outer bailey, their voices creating a constant hum of activity. Horses stamped and whinnied, armor clanked, and weapons were sharpened with the rhythmic ring of metal on stone. At the center of this activity sat the king, making final decisions about strategy and supplies, while trying to project a confidence he did not always feel. The night before a campaign began was often sleepless for medieval monarchs. Let your mind drift to a royal pavilion on the eve of battle, where the king lay on a simple cot, listening to the sounds of his army settling down for the night. Guards walked their rounds, their footsteps marking time like a funeral dirge. In the distance, enemy campfires twinkled like fallen stars, each one representing men who would try to kill him when morning came. The king's armor, carefully maintained by skilled craftsmen, hung nearby like an empty shell of the man he would have to become at dawn. Each piece was designed to protect his body, but nothing could shield his soul from the weight of command. He knew that his decisions in the coming battle would determine not only his own fate, but the fate of every man who followed him into combat. Medieval warfare was brutal and personal in ways that modern conflicts are not. The king fought alongside his men, sharing their dangers and their suffering. He could see the faces of the enemies he killed, hear their final words, witness the moment when life left their eyes. These images haunted royal dreams for years afterward, creating a gallery of ghosts that followed kings to their graves. But perhaps even more difficult than the actual fighting was the aftermath of victory. Picture a battlefield at sunset, littered with the bodies of the dead and dying. The king walked among them, making decisions about prisoners and ransoms while trying to ignore the pleas of wounded men calling for their mothers. Victory celebrations felt hollow when they were built on such foundations of human suffering. The treatment of prisoners presented another moral dilemma for medieval kings. Christian doctrine demanded mercy, but political reality often required harsh measures to prevent future rebellions. The king had to balance his personal conscience against the safety of his realm, knowing that excessive mercy might be seen as weakness and invite further attacks. Let yourself consider the loneliness of command that became most apparent during military campaigns. The king could not show fear or uncertainty to his troops, for their morale depended on his apparent confidence. He could not seek comfort from his subordinates, for that would undermine his authority. He bore the weight of every tactical decision alone, knowing that mistakes would cost lives that could never be restored. The logistics of medieval warfare created additional stress for royal commanders. Armies moved slowly and consumed enormous quantities of food and supplies. The king had to coordinate with local lords to ensure adequate provisions, while also managing the complex politics of temporary alliances. A single miscalculation could leave thousands of men starving in hostile territory. Disease was often a more dangerous enemy than human opponents. Medieval armies were breeding grounds for plague, dysentery, and other illnesses that could devastate fighting forces faster than any battle. The king watched helplessly as strong young men wasted away from diseases that had no known cure, their deaths serving no strategic purpose and bringing no glory to anyone. The return from campaign brought its own challenges. Victory parades might impress the common people, but the king knew the true cost of his achievements. Treasury depleted by military expenses, noble families mourning their dead sons, farmland devastated by the passage of armies. These were the hidden prices of martial success that weighed heavily on royal consciences. Autumn was the season of harvest, but for medieval kings, it was also the season of reckoning. The year's campaigns were over, the results were final, and it was time to assess what had been gained and what had been lost. Picture a king walking through his castle's great hall in the soft light of October afternoon, studying the faces of the courtiers who had survived another year of war and intrigue. The autumn court sessions were particularly intense, as nobles who had been away on campaign returned with their own agendas and grievances. Alliances that had seemed solid in spring might have shifted during the summer's fighting. New power balances had to be established and old scores settled. The king navigated these treacherous waters while trying to prepare his realm for the challenges of the coming year. Winter's return brought a kind of exhausted relief to medieval monarchs. The campaign season was over, the major decisions had been made, and there was time for reflection and planning. But winter also brought its own sorrows, as news arrived of subjects who had died during the year's conflicts, of territories lost to enemies, of alliances that had crumbled under pressure. Picture the king in his private chambers on a cold December evening, reading reports from across his realm by the light of a crackling fire. Each document told a story of human struggle: peasants who had lost their homes to raiders, merchants whose trade routes had been disrupted by war, monasteries that had been forced to shelter refugees from the year's conflicts. The approach of Christmas brought complex emotions for medieval rulers. The religious celebration emphasized peace and goodwill. But the king's year had been filled with violence and political calculation. The contrast between Christian ideals and royal reality was never more apparent than during the season that celebrated the birth of the Prince of Peace. Royal Christmas celebrations were magnificent affairs, but they were also carefully choreographed political events. Every detail of the feast, every gift given and received, every toast proposed, all carried political significance that had to be carefully managed. The king could not simply enjoy the holiday. He had to perform his role as the embodiment of royal authority and divine favor. Let your thoughts drift to the private moments between public ceremonies, when the king might steal away to his chapel for genuine prayer rather than political display. In these quiet interludes, surrounded by the familiar sense of incense and burning candles, he could acknowledge the weight of his failures and the burden of his successes. The new year brought not hope, but apprehension to medieval monarchs. Another cycle was beginning, with its inevitable challenges and sorrows. The king looked ahead to 12 more months of impossible decisions, dangerous campaigns, and political intrigue. The crown that had felt heavy the year before seemed to grow heavier with each passing season. Age brought no relief to medieval kings. If anything, the burdens increased as their physical strength diminished. Younger nobles began to question the aging monarch's ability to lead, while enemies saw weakness where experience should have commanded respect. The king found himself caught between the vigor of youth and the wisdom of age, satisfying neither completely. The education of royal heirs created another source of stress for medieval kings. The monarch had to prepare his sons for the throne, while also protecting them from the harsh realities that would eventually consume their lives. Too much protection would leave them unprepared for kingship. Too little would destroy their childhood innocence unnecessarily early. Picture a king watching his young son practice swordplay in the castle courtyard, knowing that the boy's laughter would someday be silenced by the weight of the crown. The father's love warred with the king's duty, creating internal conflicts that had no satisfactory resolution. The child would have to be sacrificed to create the ruler, just as the man had been sacrificed years before. The longevity of medieval dynasties depended on successful succession, but the transition from one reign to the next was always fraught with danger. The dying king had to manage the complex politics of inheritance while dealing with his own mortality. Rival claimants gathered like vultures, waiting for any sign of weakness that might provide an opportunity for rebellion. Even in his final moments, the medieval king served the state rather than himself. His deathbed became a stage for political theater, with every word recorded for posterity and every gesture analyzed for its implications. There was no privacy in royal death, no quiet passing surrounded by loved ones. The king died as he had lived, alone in a crowd, performing his role until the very end. The funeral ceremonies that followed were magnificent tributes to royal authority, but they also marked the beginning of uncertainty for the kingdom. Until the new king was firmly established on the throne, the realm remained vulnerable to internal strife and external attack. The dead monarch's legacy would be judged not by his personal virtues, but by the stability of the succession he left behind. Yet despite all these sorrows and burdens, medieval kingship continued to attract ambitious men who believed they could master its challenges. Each new ruler began his reign with hope and determination, convinced that he would succeed where others had failed. The cycle continued, generation after generation, as the crown passed from father to son or from brother to brother, carrying its ancient weight into each new age. The miserable truth about being a medieval king was that it required the complete sacrifice of personal happiness for public duty. These rulers gave up everything that makes life meaningful: love, friendship, peace of mind, personal fulfillment, in service to an abstract ideal of royal responsibility that consumed their humanity while preserving their authority. As our gentle journey through these ancient sorrows draws to its close, let yourself feel compassion for these long-dead rulers who struggled with burdens that would crush most modern souls. They were not the glorious figures of legend, but flawed human beings doing their best in impossible circumstances, carrying weights that grew heavier with each passing year until they finally laid down their crowns in death. Rest now in the knowledge that their struggles have ended, their burdens have been lifted, and their souls have found the peace that eluded them in life. The medieval world has passed away, taking with it the particular sorrows of kingship that we have explored together tonight. What remains is only the gentle understanding that all human suffering eventually finds its end in the quiet darkness of eternal rest. Sleep peacefully, dear listener, knowing that tomorrow's challenges, however difficult they may seem, are lighter than the crowns worn by the medieval kings whose stories we have shared. Their ancient sorrows fade into the soft silence of the night, leaving only the comforting knowledge that all burdens, no matter how heavy, eventually find their rest. Let us linger for a few more gentle moments in the shadows of these ancient castles, where the echoes of royal footsteps have long since faded into silence. Picture yourself walking through the empty corridors of a medieval palace, your soft steps the only sound disturbing the profound quiet that has settled over these stones like dust. The tapestries that once depicted glorious victories now hang in tatters, their golden threads dimmed by centuries of neglect. Sunlight filters through narrow windows, casting long shadows that seem to hold the memory of all the kings who once paced these halls in worry and desperation. Here, in this peaceful ruin, we can finally understand the full weight of what these rulers endured. Imagine the countless nights when medieval kings stood exactly where you stand now, gazing out at their kingdoms through these same windows. They watched the same moon rise over the same fields, but their hearts were heavy with responsibilities that you and I can barely comprehend. Every light they saw in the distance represented subjects whose lives depended on their wisdom, whose safety rested in their hands. The wine cellars far below these chambers once echoed with the sounds of royal feasts, but even in celebration, the medieval king could never truly relax. Each toast proposed was a political statement, each conversation a potential trap, each smile a mask concealing the enormous weight of sovereignty. The very wine he drank had to be tested for poison, reminding him that even in moments of apparent joy, death lurked nearby. Consider the private libraries where these rulers sought solace in books and learning. Picture dusty volumes of philosophy and theology, their pages marked by royal hands seeking answers to impossible questions. How does one balance mercy with justice? How does one serve God while serving the state? How does one maintain humanity while exercising absolute power? The books provided no easy answers, only more questions that troubled royal sleep. The royal gardens, now overgrown with wild roses and forgotten herbs, once provided brief respites from the pressures of the throne. Here, a king might steal a few precious minutes to walk alone among the flowers, breathing air that wasn't thick with political intrigue. Even these moments of peace were shadowed by the knowledge that enemies might be plotting while he indulged in such simple pleasures. Think of the private chambers where royal children once played, their laughter echoing through rooms that would later know only the heavy silence of political calculation. The transformation from carefree prince to burdened king was inevitable and heartbreaking. Childhood ended abruptly with the first lesson in statecraft, the first understanding that personal desires must always yield to royal duty. The castle's highest tower, where kings often retreated for solitude, offers a perfect metaphor for the isolation of medieval monarchy. From that elevated position, the ruler could see his entire kingdom spread below him, beautiful, productive, and utterly dependent on his decisions. The view was magnificent, but it was also a constant reminder of the weight of responsibility that could never be set aside. Picture the royal stables, where magnificent war horses stood ready for battle. These animals, bred for strength and courage, were partners in the king's most dangerous endeavors. Many kings formed deeper bonds with their horses than with most humans, for these creatures expected nothing more than care and kindness. In a world where every human relationship was complicated by politics, the honest affection of a horse provided rare comfort. The castle's chapel bells, silent now for centuries, once marked the hours of a king's days, with reminders of his spiritual obligations. Each toll called him to prayer, to reflection, to acknowledgement of his dependence on divine guidance. Yet the same bells that called him to worship also reminded him of his mortality, counting down the precious hours of a life lived entirely in service to others. The royal treasury, hidden deep within the castle's most secure chambers, represented both power and burden. The gold and jewels stored there were not personal wealth, but the financial foundation of the kingdom's stability. Every coin spent had to be justified, every expenditure weighed against competing needs. The king was simultaneously the richest and the poorest man in his realm, rich in possessions he could never truly enjoy, poor in the freedom to use them as he wished. Even the royal kitchens tell a story of isolation and fear. The elaborate meals prepared there were works of art, but they were also potential instruments of assassination. The king's food was prepared by trusted servants, tasted by loyal retainers, and served with ceremony that masked constant vigilance. Simple hunger could never be simply satisfied when every bite might be your last. The castle's dungeons, dark and forbidding, held prisoners whose fates the king alone could determine. Walking past those iron-barred cells, the monarch was reminded daily of his power over life and death. Some prisoners were political enemies who had once been friends. Others were common criminals whose stories he would never know. Each represented a decision he had made, a judgment he had rendered, a life he had irrevocably changed. The royal mint, where coins were struck with the king's image, created currency that carried his face throughout the realm and beyond. Every transaction conducted with that money was a reminder of royal authority, but it was also a symbol of the king's responsibility for his kingdom's economic health. Market failures, trade disruptions, and currency debasements all reflected on royal competence. Think of the royal messengers who rode day and night to carry the king's commands across vast distances. These men risked their lives to ensure that royal will was communicated accurately and quickly. Their dust-covered horses and exhausted faces were constant reminders of the vast scope of medieval kingship, the impossibility of truly knowing what was happening in distant corners of the realm. The royal physicians, with their limited understanding of medicine and their dangerous treatments, represented another source of royal anxiety. When illness struck, The king had to choose between various remedies that were as likely to harm as to heal. The knowledge that a simple infection could end his reign and throw the kingdom into chaos added another layer of stress to every minor ailment. The court musicians and entertainers provided distractions from royal cares, but even their performances carried political undertones. Songs praised royal victories and legitimacy, while subtle criticisms might be hidden in seemingly innocent melodies. The king had to listen with both pleasure and suspicion, enjoying the music while analyzing its potential meanings. Royal birthdays and anniversaries were public celebrations that marked the passage of time in ways both joyous and melancholy. Each year that passed brought the king closer to his own mortality while adding to the accumulated weight of decisions made and opportunities lost. Age brought experience but also regret, wisdom but also weariness. The royal seal, pressed into warm wax thousands of times during a reign, was the physical manifestation of royal authority. Every document that bore that seal carried the full weight of the crown's power, but it also represented an irrevocable commitment. Once the wax cooled and hardened, the king's word was law, regardless of any doubts he might harbor. Even the royal robes, magnificent though they were, told stories of burden and sacrifice. The ermine trim came from countless small creatures that died for royal splendor. The golden threads were spun from metal that could have fed armies. The precious gems were mined by workers whose names the king would never know. Wearing such finery was a constant reminder of the cost of monarchy, not just to the king himself, but to all the unknown people whose labors supported royal magnificence. The royal forest, reserved for the king's hunting pleasure, might seem like a luxury, but even recreational pursuits carried political weight for medieval monarchs. Hunting was training for war, a display of royal courage and an opportunity for diplomatic encounters with visiting nobles. Even leisure time was work in disguise. As we prepare to leave these ancient halls and allow their stones to rest once more in silence, let yourself feel the profound peace that comes with understanding. These medieval kings, with all their power and privilege, their crowns and ceremonies, were fundamentally no different from any of us. They struggled with doubt, they yearned for love, they feared death, and they sought meaning in lives that often seemed to offer little personal satisfaction. Their greatest tragedy was not the political failures or military defeats recorded in history books, but the simple fact that they were human beings forced to live inhuman lives. They were denied the basic comforts that most of us take for granted: the freedom to choose our companions, to express our true feelings, to pursue our personal interests, to live without constant fear of betrayal. Yet in their sacrifice, these rulers also achieved a kind of nobility that transcends the centuries. They bore burdens that would have crushed lesser souls, made decisions that required superhuman strength, and endured isolation that would have driven many to madness. They paid the ultimate price for the stability and continuity of their kingdoms. Their stories remind us that leadership, true leadership, has always required enormous personal sacrifice. The crowns they wore were not symbols of privilege, but instruments of service, beautiful burdens that transformed ordinary men into vessels for something greater than themselves. Now, as the last light fades from these ancient windows and the shadows lengthen into the gentle darkness of sleep, let their sacrifices inspire rather than sadden you. Their long struggles are over, their heavy crowns have been laid down, and their troubled souls have found the rest that was denied them in life. Rest peacefully now, knowing that their ancient sorrows have taught us something valuable about the nature of duty, sacrifice, and human endurance. In your dreams tonight, may you find the peace that eluded these medieval kings, secure in the knowledge that their struggles were not in vain if they help us understand the true cost of leadership and the precious value of the freedom we too often take for granted. Sleep well, dear listener, and wake tomorrow with gratitude for the simple liberty to live your own life, make your own choices, and pursue your own happiness. Privileges that the medieval kings we have remembered tonight never knew, but died believing were worth preserving for their subjects. Their gift to us was the sacrifice of their own contentment so that future generations might know a lighter burden and a gentler reign. The ancient halls are quiet now. The royal footsteps have faded into eternity, and all that remains is the soft whisper of wind through empty chambers where kings once wrestled with the weight of crowns that were far too heavy for any mortal soul to bear. But their burden has become our freedom, their sorrow has become our joy, and their sleepless nights have purchased our peaceful rest. Good night.